The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of tobacco and horse leather, and it warned Mae Rhodes in no uncertain terms that the man heading toward her town was the most dangerous soul west of the Mississippi. Mae stood on the porch of the Rhodes homestead, the New Mexico dust swirling around the hem of her calico dress, squinting at the handwriting that crawled across the yellowed paper like something written in haste or in fear. The summer of 1878 had already been brutal, the kind of heat that cracked the earth open like old bread and made the cattle stand motionless in the shade of the cottonwoods. Mae was 24 years old, recently widowed after her husband Thomas had been thrown from a horse and broken his neck the previous autumn, and she had been running the Rhodes cattle operation alone ever since, with the help of two aging ranch hands named Cliff and Dell. She was not the sort of woman who startled easily. She had buried a husband, negotiated with cattle buyers who thought a woman's signature meant nothing, and once talked a rattlesnake off her kitchen doorstep with nothing but a broom and firm language. But this letter gave her pause. It was from a man named Garland Price, who ran a trading post in the town of Cimarron, about 40 miles northeast. She had met Garland twice, both times at the Regional Cattle Exchange in Santa Fe, and had found him to be a careful, deliberate man who did not waste words. Garland was not the type to write letters for sport. His message was short and without ceremony. He wrote that a drifter named Amos Walden had come through Cimarron 3 weeks prior, and that by the time he left, 2 men had been laid up and the entire town had been on edge. He wrote that Amos Walden was a man to be avoided, and that he had heard the man was moving south toward the Loma Blanca Valley where Mae's property sat. He urged her to keep her rifle close. Mae read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. The second letter arrived 4 days later, and it came from a woman named Ruth Calvert, whom Mae had known since childhood. Ruth lived in the small settlement of Rojo Creek, which sat directly between Cimarron and Loma Blanca along the old trade road. Ruth was a schoolteacher and the wife of a former lawman, and was not given to gossip or exaggeration. Her letter was longer than Garland's, written in her even, schoolteacher's hand, and she described Amos Walden with considerable gravity. She wrote that he had arrived in Rojo Creek without announcement and had left chaos in his wake. She wrote that a fight had broken out, that a man named Hendricks had been badly humiliated, and that the whole town had breathed a collective sigh of relief when Walden had ridden out south. She called him unpredictable. She called him hard-eyed. She called him a man who carried trouble like other men carried a bedroll, simply as a matter of course. She signed her letter with her warmest regards and a firm suggestion that Mae lock her gate. Mae stood at her kitchen table and read that letter with the morning coffee growing cold beside her hand. Outside, Cliff was arguing with one of the fence posts about something, and Dell was hitching the wagon for a supply run to town. The world outside looked like every other morning in Loma Blanca, ordinary, dusty, sun-bleached and wide. Mae folded Ruth's letter and placed it beside Garland's in the small wooden box where she kept important papers. She was not afraid. Or rather, she recognized the feeling in her chest as something more nuanced than fear. It was a kind of heightened attention, the same feeling she got when weather was building on the horizon, and she needed to decide whether to bring the cattle in from the south pasture. The third letter came a week after that, and this one surprised her most because of who it was from. Sheriff Lonnie Briggs of Mora County, a man she had met precisely once at a territorial meeting in Albuquerque, and who she understood to be a solid and no-nonsense lawman of considerable experience. Sheriff Briggs did not write long letters. His message contained exactly 3 sentences. The first: Amos Walden is headed south from Rojo Creek, and I have reason to believe his destination is the Loma Blanca Valley. The second: he is a man with a record of violent altercations, and I would urge any person of the valley to exercise extreme caution. The third: I will be riding through in approximately 2 weeks on my regular circuit if any assistance is needed. 3 letters, 3 warnings, 3 different people, each of whom she respected, each of whom was telling her the same thing with varying degrees of alarm. Mae Rhodes read that third letter while standing in the doorway of the barn, and then she did something that perhaps none of those letter writers expected her to do. She decided to find out what Amos Walden had actually done. It was not a reckless decision. Mae thought it through with the same methodical patience she applied to everything: the calving records, the water rights negotiations, the painful accounting books that she reviewed each month at the kitchen table by lamplight. If a man was dangerous, she wanted to know the nature of that danger, not the shape of the fear around him, but the actual facts. She had learned the hard way that fear had a way of inflating itself, of growing in the telling, of borrowing details from other stories, until it became something monstrous that bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. She decided she would write to Garland Price first because he was the most recent and the most precise. She sat at the kitchen table that evening and wrote him a single direct question. What exactly did Amos Walden do in Cimarron? She sent Dell to town the next morning with the letter. Then she wrote to Ruth Calvert with the same question rephrased in the polite language appropriate for her old friend. And she wrote a careful, respectful letter to Sheriff Briggs asking him to describe the specifics of the violent altercations he had referenced. Then she waited, because waiting was something Mae Rhodes had always been good at. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued with its relentless demands. A section of the north fence had come down in a windstorm, and 3 heifers had wandered onto the Delgado property next door, requiring a polite but firm conversation with old Ernesto Delgado and a careful hour of fence repair in the baking heat. The pump at the east trough was developing a rattle that Cliff insisted would work itself out, and Dell equally insisted would destroy itself entirely within a fortnight. Mae listened to both of them, consulted her own knowledge of pumps, and ordered a new gasket from the hardware store in town, which she installed herself on a Sunday afternoon. She was up on the pump housing, her hair pinned back and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, when she heard hoofbeats on the main road. She did not think much of it at first because the road that ran along the eastern edge of her property was a public road, and people used it regularly. But something made her look up some quality in the sound of the horse, a steady, unhurried rhythm that was different from the quick, purposeful trot of someone with a destination. This was the sound of a horse being ridden by someone who was in no hurry at all, or perhaps by someone who was arriving somewhere after a very long journey. The man who came into view was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was riding a tall bay horse that looked road-weary but well cared for, the animal's coat dusty, but its hooves clean and its tack properly fitted. The man himself was lean, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that showed beneath the brim of a wide hat that had seen considerable weather. He rode with an ease that suggested he spent more time in the saddle than out of it. He wore a plain shirt, a brown vest and trail-worn boots. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, which was nothing extraordinary in 1878 New Mexico, where going unarmed was more remarkable than going armed. He turned his horse from the road onto her property lane without hesitation, which told her he knew where he was going, and he rode toward the barn at that same unhurried pace until he saw her on top of the pump housing. He pulled up about 20 yards away and regarded her without apparent alarm or particular friendliness, simply with the neutral attention of a man who had arrived somewhere and was orienting himself. "Rhodes' property," he said. "It is," Mae said from her elevated position on the pump, which she found she did not mind because it put her at eye level with him rather than looking up. "Heard you might be needing help with ranch work," he said. "I'm looking for work." Mae looked at him steadily. She had not advertised for help. She had mentioned to Ernesto Delgado's eldest son that she might need someone by fall if the herd expanded as she hoped, but she had not made any formal inquiry. "Who told you that?" she said. "Man at the trading post in Cimarron," he said. "Name of Garland Price." Something shifted in Me's chest. She set down her wrench very carefully and looked at this man again with new attention. "What is your name?" she said. "Amos Walden," he said, without a flicker of anything except the mild attentiveness he had shown from the beginning. Mae Rhodes looked at Amos Walden for a long moment. The pump dripped. A mockingbird made a racket in the cottonwood near the water trough. Cliff had stopped arguing with the fence post and was watching from about 50 yards away with the expression of a man who could not decide whether he needed to come closer. "You had better step down from that horse, Mr. Walden," Mae said. "I have some questions for you." He dismounted without argument, which she noted. He looped his reins over the hitching rail by the barn and turned to face her as she climbed down from the pump housing and wiped her hands on the cloth she kept tucked in her work belt. She was a tall woman, nearly 5'8", and she met his eyes directly. They were a dark shade between brown and gray, and they held a steadiness that she found herself reading carefully. "I received a letter from Garland Price last week," she said. "He told me you were a dangerous man and I should keep my rifle close." Amos Walden did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, slightly tired. "I know he said something of that nature," he said. "And Ruth Calvert in Rojo Creek said much the same," Mae said, "as did Sheriff Briggs of Mora County." He absorbed this without visible agitation. "I see," he said quietly. "I also wrote back to all three of them," Mae said, "asking them what exactly you had done. I have not received their replies yet, but I find I would rather hear your account before I read theirs so that I can compare the two. Are you willing to tell me what happened in Cimarron?" He looked at her with something that shifted very slightly in his expression, not softness exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as though he had been expecting something other than this. "You wrote back and asked them for specifics," he said. "I did. Most people would have just loaded their rifle." "I have no objection to loading a rifle," Mae said, "but information is generally more useful. What happened in Cimarron?" Amos Walden took his hat off and held it in both hands, which struck her as a gesture of genuine consideration rather than performance. "There were two men in the saloon," he said. "They were drunk and they were working up to robbing the trading post Garland's place. I had been in Cimarron for 2 days and I had noticed them making plans over the previous night. When they went to do it, I stopped them. One of them threw a punch and I hit him back harder than I needed to, and he went down and cracked his head on a barrel. He was not seriously hurt, but he was laid up. The other man pulled a knife and I took it from him, and I was not gentle about it, and he also needed some time to recover. Garland Price saw the aftermath, which was, it looked bad. There was blood. He did not see what had led to it." He paused. "I did not think it was necessary to explain myself." Mae studied him. "Why did you not explain yourself?" "Because the men I stopped were local," he said simply. "Garland knew them. I was a stranger passing through. It would have looked like I was defending myself with a story, which would have seemed self-serving. I preferred to let the situation be what it was." Mae was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "And in Rojo Creek," she said, "Ruth Calvert mentioned a man named Hendricks." Amos Walden's expression shifted very slightly, and she thought she saw something beneath the steadiness, something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. "Hendricks was making advances on a woman who was very clearly trying to end the conversation," he said. "She was a young woman, maybe 17, and she was frightened and he was not listening. I told him to stop. He did not appreciate being told. We had words which became loud words, which became a physical altercation that I ended as efficiently as I could. The woman left. Hendricks was humiliated. He met her eyes directly. I will not apologize for that one." Mae held his gaze. Something was moving in her chest that she identified as recognition, not of this specific man, but of the situation. She had grown up being told that certain kinds of men were dangerous, and she had lived long enough to understand that danger wore many faces and the most dangerous men were not always the ones people warned you about. She made a decision. "You can stay," she said. "I will pay you fair wages. You will bunk in the room off the barn." I will hear what Garland and Ruth and Sheriff Briggs write back, and we will revisit this conversation if what they say contradicts what you have told me." She held out her hand. "Do we have an agreement?" He looked at her hand for 1 second and then took it. His grip was firm and quick. "We have an agreement, Mrs. Rhodes," she said, "though me is what most people use." "Me," he said, and something in the way he said it, level and careful, like he was placing the words somewhere it would be safe, made her look at him one extra moment before she turned back toward the pump. The first days with Amos Walden on the property were a study in cautious observation. Me watched him the way she watched any new element in her carefully maintained world, with attention, and without much display of what she was thinking. Cliff watched him with unconcealed suspicion and the specific wariness of a man who had been at a property long enough to feel proprietary about it. Dell, who was the more phlegmatic of the two old ranch hands, watched him with the philosophical patience of someone who had seen many things come and go, and had reached the conclusion that most things were neither as good nor as bad as they appeared at the outset. What me observed was this: Amos Walden worked. He worked in the concentrated, unhurried way that she recognized as the mark of someone who understood physical labor not as a burden but as a practice, something to be done well and completely before stopping. He repaired the north fence with Cliff, or rather, he repaired the north fence while Cliff supervised and occasionally contributed, without complaint or conversation that was not directly related to the task. He fixed the pump with a facility that told her he had done this kind of mechanical work before. He was good with the cattle, patient with the ones that were skittish, and efficient with the ones that simply needed to be moved. He did not ask unnecessary questions, but when he had a question, he asked it directly and listened to the answer with genuine attention. He took his meals at the outdoor table behind the barn with Cliff and Dell, which was the arrangement for hired help on the property. Me ate in the house. But on the third evening, when a thunderstorm arrived without much warning and drove everyone into the covered porch of the main house, she found herself sitting across the outdoor table from him under the shelter of the porch roof, while the rain came down in silver sheets, and the lightning illuminated the distant Sangre de Cristo peaks with brief theatrical brilliance. Cliff and Dell had retreated to the bunkhouse at the first sign of rain, being men of considerable experience in identifying when they were not needed. Me had come out for her evening coffee and found Amos Walden already there, apparently having arrived with the same idea and the same tin cup. They sat for a moment with the rain as the only conversation. "The Delgado property to the north," he said finally, "the fence line at the corner marker, the northeast corner. It is not where the original survey marks say it should be." Me looked at him. "I know," she said. "It moved about 6 feet over the years. Old Ernesto and I have an understanding about it. It does not affect the grazing, and I have never pushed it." He nodded. "I was not suggesting you push it. I was noting that when we extend the line this autumn, the new post should account for the correct survey rather than the drifted one." "That is a sensible observation," Me said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "How long have you been in New Mexico?" "4 years," he said. "Before that, Colorado, before that, Kansas. You move around a great deal." "I have," he said. He looked out at the rain. "I had a property once. I do not have it anymore. After that, I found it easier to keep moving." She did not ask about the property because she recognized the kind of answer that was given in a certain tone, complete in itself, not inviting extension. She understood that kind of answer because she gave them sometimes too. "Where are you from originally?" she said instead. "Missouri," he said. "A town you would not know, near the Iowa line." He looked at her. "You, here," she said. "My father built this house. I have lived in this valley my entire life except for 2 years in Albuquerque when I married Thomas." She paused. "My husband died last autumn." "I know," he said quietly. "Garland Price mentioned it. He said you were running the property alone." There was nothing prurient in how he said it, nothing that suggested he was measuring her circumstances for opportunity. He simply said it as a fact he had been given and was acknowledging in case she wondered what he knew. "He recommended I hire you," Mae said, with a slight sharpness she had not quite intended. "He recommended your property as a place looking for help," Amos said evenly. "Whether he knew it was me asking is a question I cannot answer with certainty. I had given him my name when I arrived in Cimarron. Whether that connection was deliberate on his part, that I do not know." Mae considered this. It was an oddly complicated thing to think about, that Garland Price had on the one hand warned her about this man, and on the other hand perhaps pointed him toward her ranch. She would need to ask Garland about that directly when his reply arrived. "You are not what I expected," she said, and then felt a flicker of something at having said it, because it revealed that she had expected something. Amos Walden looked at her with that stillness that she was beginning to understand was not blankness, but rather a kind of careful attention. "What did you expect?" he said. "Something more alarming," she said honestly. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first approximation of a smile she had seen from him, and it lasted only a moment, but it changed his face entirely, made it younger, less guarded, briefly open. "I am occasionally alarming," he said, "under the right circumstances." "I will take your word for that," Mae said, and found that she was smiling too, which surprised her. The reply from Garland Price arrived on a Thursday, delivered by Dell when he came back from the weekly supply run to town. Mae took it to the kitchen table while Amos Walden was out in the south pasture, checking the condition of the water access after the week's rains. She unfolded it and read it carefully. Garland Price had written more than she expected. He began with a slightly defensive paragraph about his original letter, acknowledging that he had written it in a state of considerable agitation after what had appeared to be a violent altercation in his trading post vicinity. Then he wrote something that shifted Mae's understanding considerably. He described having discovered, 3 days after Amos Walden had left Cimarron, that the 2 men who had been laid up were known petty criminals who had been suspected of robbing the Ortega trading post in Taos the previous spring. He wrote that upon reflection, he had come to understand that Walden had very likely intervened on the behalf of his property, and that the 2 men laid up were not innocent bystanders but active aggressors. He wrote that he had recommended Walden to a property in the Loma Blanca Valley. He had not known it was Mae's property specifically, because he had felt he owed the man something. And then at the bottom of the letter he had added a postscript that said, "If it is indeed your property he has gone to, Mae, I believe he is a good man, and I am sorry for the confusion my first letter may have caused." Mae sat with that letter for a while. Ruth Calvert's reply arrived 2 days later. Ruth's letter was long and thorough and characteristically Ruth. She had, in the weeks since Amos Walden had left Rojo Creek, done considerable investigation. She had spoken to the young woman in question, whose name was Clara Medina, and Clara had confirmed that Walden had intervened when Hendricks had refused to let her leave the general store. Clara had been frightened and grateful. Ruth had also spoken to 2 other people in town who had witnessed the altercation, and both of them described Walden as having been calm and controlled until Hendricks had physically grabbed the young woman, at which point Walden had stepped in with considerable force but, and Ruth underlined this, only enough force to end the situation. Ruth concluded her letter by saying that she had written her original warning in good faith, but with incomplete information, and that she wished she had asked more questions before putting ink to paper. She signed it with warmth and something that read as genuine mortification. Sheriff Briggs's reply was the last to arrive, a week after Ruth's, and it was characteristically terse. He wrote that upon checking his records, he found that the violent altercations attributed to Walden consisted of 2 incidents, Cimarron and Rojo Creek, and that in both cases Walden had been responding to aggression rather than initiating it. He noted that Walden had no warrants against him in Mora County or any adjacent county, and that he had been, in his original letter, repeating what he had been told by local witnesses rather than verified fact. He wrote that this was a failure of his own thoroughness, and he wanted to correct the record. He also wrote, in that same direct three-sentence style, "He is not a man to fear. He is a man to understand. Those are different things." Mae folded all 3 letters and placed them in her wooden box beside the original 3. Then she went to find Amos Walden. She found him in the barn, mending a piece of harness with the focused care he brought to all the work he did, and she told him directly what each letter had said. She stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind her, and she read him the relevant parts of all 3 replies, not because she thought she owed him an explanation, but because she thought he deserved to know. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, still turning the harness in his hands with the mechanical absentness of someone whose hands need something to do when their mind is occupied. "Thank you," he said at last, "for asking." "You could have told me they would say this," Mae said. "I could have," he agreed. "But then it would have only been my word. This way it is theirs." He looked up at her. "You did not need to share it with me." "Why did you?" Mae thought about this. "Because I think you have been carrying the weight of how other people told the story," she said carefully. "And I think you should know that the people who told it have reconsidered." Something moved behind his eyes. It was there and gone quickly, but she had been watching him long enough by now to recognize it as genuine emotion, something that had been held at a distance and had briefly come close. "That is a generous thing to say," he said. "It is an accurate thing to say," she replied. "There is a difference." That was the moment, though she did not identify it as such until much later, when the thing between them shifted from the careful professional courtesy of employer and hired hand into something with a different quality. It was subtle and it was not spoken, but it was there. The way a change in air pressure before a storm is not visible but is unmistakable to someone who knows what to feel for. August in the Loma Blanca Valley was a relentless machine of heat and work. The monsoon rains came most afternoons, brief and violent and cooling only in the immediate moment before the heat closed back in. Mae worked from before sunrise until after dark, and she was aware, without making anything particular of it, that Amos Walden kept similar hours. She would come out sometimes at first light to find him already in the barn or at the pump, and in the evenings when she walked the property to do her last check before bed, she would see his lamp burning in the room off the barn. They talked more. It happened gradually and naturally, the way conversation between people who work in proximity and are not naturally inclined to silence does. They talked about the cattle and the property first, then about New Mexico and the territory, then about wider things, the news that came through the paper Dell brought from town every week, the question of statehood, the ongoing complications of land grants and water rights in the territory that touched every rancher's life. They did not talk about personal things except in small increments, and Mae noticed that he matched her pace, that he did not push ahead of what she offered, did not press into territory she had not opened. She found herself thinking about him when he was not there, which she noticed with the same careful attention she brought to most things, and decided to simply observe without acting on. One evening in late August, she was reviewing the ledgers on the kitchen table when she heard shouting from the direction of the road, and then the sound of a horse coming at speed up her property lane. She was on the porch before she fully had the thought to go there, and Amos was coming from the barn at the same moment, and they arrived at the porch rail together to see young Tomas Delgado, Ernesto's grandson, hauling up his horse in her yard with his face white with panic. Mrs. Rhodes, the Lema Ranch fire. The Lema Ranch was 2 miles south, belonging to a family Mae had known her whole life. Caridad Lema and her 3 children lived there alone since her husband had gone to work in the mines at Silver City the year before. A fire on a dry summer evening with the wind running the way it was running could be catastrophic. Mae was down the porch steps and at her horse before the sentence was finished. She was aware of Amos Walden at her shoulder, and of Cliff and Dell emerging from the bunkhouse at the sound. She did not give orders so much as the situation organized them all. Dell and Cliff loaded the wagon with water barrels and heavy blankets, and me and Amos rode ahead on horseback. They could see the orange light above the tree line before they were halfway there. When they arrived, the llama barn was fully involved, and the fire was moving toward the house on the evening wind. Caridad Lemma was in the yard with her 3 children, a boy of about 12, a girl of perhaps 8, and a baby on her hip, her face streaked with soot, and her expression the controlled terror of a mother who is managing her fear for the sake of her children. What followed was 2 hours of organized, exhausting work. The house was saved. The barn was not, but the house was saved and the livestock were driven clear, and by the time the wagon with Dell and Cliff arrived, there was enough organized effort to contain the fire to the barn's footprint. Me worked until her arms shook, and she was aware in the concentrated focus of that work of Amos Walden moving through it with her, not at her direction, because there was no time for direction, but in that way that 2 people who have begun to understand each other's instincts can work as a unit without needing to speak. When it was done, they were both sooty and exhausted, and Caridad was sitting on the ground outside her house, with the baby asleep against her chest, and her older children curled against her sides. Me sat down beside her in the dirt, because the woman needed company more than she needed anything else at that moment, and they sat together in the dark with the embers hissing behind them. Amos Walden brought water in the bucket, and then he brought blankets from the wagon, and then he quietly disappeared to check on the livestock that had been driven into the south field. He watched him go, the lantern light making his shadow long and unsteady on the ground, and felt something she could not quite name. On the ride home in the small hours, the sky just began to show the faintest suggestion of gray at the eastern edge. Me and Amos rode side by side and did not talk for the first mile. Then she said, "You knew exactly what to do." "I have been in emergencies before," he said. "Not all people perform well in them," she said. "Some fall apart and some become extraordinary." "You became extraordinary." He looked at her, and in the pre-dawn dimness she could see that the comment had landed somewhere real in him. "You were not so ordinary yourself," he said. She smiled, though it came out more tired than she intended. "We make a good team," she said. The words hung in the air between them with more weight than she had put into them. She felt him notice it. She noticed it herself. Neither of them said anything more until they reached the ranch, and then they said good night with a formality that was slightly different from their usual formality, more careful, more aware of itself. The replies from Garland, Ruth, and Sheriff Briggs had each done something to Me's understanding of who Amos Walden was, but it was the fire at the Lemma Ranch that did something to her heart. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this, even if she was not yet ready to do anything with that acknowledgement. September arrived and brought slightly cooler evenings and the beginning of the work that preceded the autumn cattle sales. Me needed the herd inventoried and sorted, the sale animals separated from the breeding stock, the calves that were weaned, and the ones that still needed time distinguished and properly recorded. It was a week of intensive work, and she hired 2 additional men from town to help for the week, but the organization of it fell to me and Amos. They spent most of each day on horseback together during that week, and it was the kind of sustained proximity that either reveals the worst of people or the best of them, because there is nowhere to retreat to and no energy left for performance. What it revealed about Amos Walden was a dry and unexpected humor that surfaced occasionally in a single sentence that she would catch herself thinking about hours later. It revealed a knowledge of cattle that went beyond technique into genuine understanding of the animals as individual creatures with specific temperaments and histories. It revealed a patience that was not passivity. He was not a passive man. She understood that clearly, but rather a genuine comfort with the pace of things. It also revealed, on a Thursday afternoon when they had been in the saddle since dawn and were taking water at the east trough while the horses drank, that he had been watching her in the same way she had been watching him. She had turned to check the position of the spare rider handling the east corner when she turned back and found his eyes on her. He did not look away, which was somehow more honest than if he had, and she held his gaze for a moment that was longer than professional courtesy required. "I owe you something," he said. "What do you owe me?" she said. "An honest account," he said. "Of the property I mentioned, the one I had before." She waited. "In Colorado," he said. "I had a place near Trinidad. I had built it over 3 years. It was not large, but it was good land, water access, good soil. I had a wife." He paused. "Her name was Eliza. She died in the winter of 1875, a fever that took her in 4 days. I could not hold the property after that. I tried for a year and I could not. So I sold it for less than it was worth because I needed to stop looking at it." He looked at his horse's neck. "I have been moving since then." Mae absorbed this quietly. "I am sorry about Eliza," she said. "I am sorry about Thomas," he said. They looked at each other across the water trough, and the afternoon held them in it, and Mae felt the particular ache of two people who understood the same specific grief regarding each other, and the way that understanding was both a sorrowful thing and a bridge. "Do you ever think about stopping?" she said. "Moving, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been thinking about it more recently than I have in some years," he said, and the simplicity and directness of it landed in her chest like something warm and inevitable and slightly terrifying. She got back on her horse and they went back to work, but the afternoon had changed in the way that afternoons sometimes do when something true has been said into them. The week of cattle work ended on a Saturday. The 2 hired men from town returned to town, and the property settled back into its regular rhythm of just the 4 of them. Dell made a remark at the outdoor table that evening about it being good to have the extra help, and Cliff said something gruff about how the fence on the southwest corner still needed attention, and Amos said he would see to it Monday, and Mae said she appreciated it, and none of what was said was what any of them were actually thinking about, which was the way of things sometimes in small communities where people were too polite or too careful to say everything they meant. That night Mae sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers, but did not open them. She sat with her coffee and the lamp and the quiet of the house, and thought about what she felt with the same methodical honesty she tried to bring to everything. She felt drawn to him in a way that had been growing since the rain on the porch, and the fire at the Lemma Ranch, and the afternoon at the East Trough. She felt that she trusted him, which was not a small thing. She felt that he saw her clearly, and did not find what he saw diminished by her widowhood or her management of the property or her directness, or any of the other things that she knew unsettled certain men. She felt that she was something real to him. She also felt that this was a situation requiring her characteristic care, because he was working for her and because neither of them were people who moved quickly, and because the last thing she wanted was to mistake her own loneliness for something clearer and truer. She opened the ledgers, determined to work, and worked for an hour, and then closed them and went to bed. On the way she passed the window that looked toward the barn. His lamp was still burning. The conversation that changed everything happened in October, on a cool morning when the light had that particular clarity of early fall in New Mexico, and the Sangre de Cristos showed a thin line of snow at their highest peaks. Mae was in the garden. She kept a kitchen garden at the south side of the house, more out of her mother's tradition than strict necessity, turning under the summer plants before the first hard frost. Amos came around the corner of the house and stopped at the garden gate, and she looked up from her work and saw something in his face she had not seen before. A kind of resolution, as though he had spent some time arriving at this moment and had finished arriving. "I need to say something to you," he said. Mae set her fork down. She straightened and looked at him over the garden fence. "Then say it," she said. He came through the gate and stood close, not inappropriately close, but closer than their usual professional distance, and she did not step back. "I am aware that I work for you," he said, and I am aware that complicates what I am going to say. If what I say makes you want me to leave, I will understand it and I will go without difficulty. But I do not think I could continue as things are without having said it." He looked at her with those dark, quiet eyes. "I am in love with you, me. I have been for some time. I do not know how to be subtle about it, and I do not believe in being indirect about things that matter. So that is what I am saying." Mae Rhodes stood in her October garden with her hands dirty from the earth, and the morning light coming over the mountains and Amos Walden looking at her with complete honest vulnerability, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been observing for 2 months come finally into its full and recognizable form. It was not just warmth or admiration or gratitude. It was love. It had been building itself quietly in the space between them since the rain on the porch, and here it was, fully formed and undeniable. "I am not going to ask you to leave," she said. He held her gaze and waited. "I am also in love with you," she said. "I have been less certain about it only because I did not want to be wrong. But I am not wrong." The look that came over his face was one of the most purely beautiful things she had ever seen, relief and joy, and something that was almost wonder, all in the same moment, quickly composed and then real and warm behind his eyes in a way that did not go away. He reached through the garden fence, and she gave him her dirty hand, and he held it, and they stood there on either side of the garden fence in the October morning light, and the Sangre de Cristos had their thin line of snow above them, and everything was very still. "I should clean my hands," Mae said. "Probably," he agreed, and he was smiling at her in a way that made the whole thing remarkable and ordinary at once. They moved from that morning into something new, something that had to be navigated with care, because their circumstances were what they were, and neither of them was careless. Amos Walden was still the hired hand on the Rhodes property, and Mae was still the widow who owned it. And while Loma Blanca was not a large or judgmental community, it was a community, and things had to be handled rightly. Mae thought about this, and so did he, and they talked about it plainly, which was becoming the pattern between them. That they talked plainly about things because both of them were done being circuitous about things that mattered. What they agreed was this: they would court properly, which in October of 1878 meant that people would know they were courting, which meant that Mae needed to tell Cliff and Dell before they noticed on their own, which she did, one morning over coffee, in the flat, direct way she handled most difficult conversations. Cliff was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "He is a good worker," which was, from Cliff, the equivalent of a speech of endorsement. Dell said, "Well, it is about time," and poured more coffee as though the matter were entirely settled. Amos told her that evening, almost laughing, that Cliff had come to find him at the barn an hour after the kitchen coffee conversation, and had stood in the barn doorway for a full 3 minutes saying nothing, and then had said, "You treat her right," and left without waiting for a response. "I said I would," Amos told me. He had already gone. She laughed, and the laughter between them was easy and warm in a way she had not expected, as though they had always known how to laugh together and had only been waiting for permission. They took their first evening walk together in the cool October air, along the road that ran the eastern edge of her property, and they walked close but not touching, which felt right for the stage they were at, the deliberate, savored stage of beginning, where everything is new and acutely felt. He told her more about Missouri, and she told him more about growing up in this valley, and the conversation went on well past the point where either of them had intended to turn back, so that they arrived home in full dark and stood at the porch steps with the stars blazing overhead in the way they do in New Mexico in October, which is one of the finest sights the world offers. "The cattle buyer from Albuquerque is coming next week," Mae said, which was not what she was thinking about. "I know," he said, which was also not what he was thinking about. They stood there in the star blaze and the cool dark air, and then he said, "Good night, Mae." In the careful way he said her name, and she said good night and went inside, and she stood in the dark of the kitchen with her hand on the back of the chair and smiled in a way she had not smiled in over a year. The cattle buyer came and went successfully. Amos handled much of the negotiation alongside me, and she noticed the way the buyer, a hard-eyed man named Pollard who was accustomed to taking advantage of women who did not know their cattle's worth, had clearly expected to be dealing with someone inexperienced. The combination of Mae's thorough knowledge and Amos's quiet, steady presence had produced a very satisfying result for the Rhodes Ranch. And Mae had caught Amos's eye across the corral during the final handshake with Pollard and seen something in it that was so purely warm and proud that it had stayed with her through the rest of the day. Caridad Lemma came to visit the following week, bringing honey cakes as an expression of continued gratitude for the night of the fire. Caridad was a warm, perceptive woman of about 40, and she looked between me and Amos during the brief time all three of them were on the porch together with the attentiveness of someone who read situations quickly. When Amos had excused himself and returned to work, Caridad looked at me with a small, certain smile. "He looks at you like the land looks at the rain," Caridad said. Mae felt her face warm, which was not something she was accustomed to. "We are courting," she said simply. Caridad reached over and patted her hand. "Thomas was a good man," she said, "and this is different, but it is also good. Both things can be true." Mae held that in her heart with considerable gratitude for the rest of the day. Both things can be true. She had been worried, without quite naming the worry, that choosing to love again was somehow a diminishment of what she had had with Thomas. Caridad's plain observation undid that worry with a simplicity that felt like clean air. In November, they had their first genuine disagreement, and Mae noted afterward that it was over the ranch, which was both inevitable and revealing. She had been considering whether to expand the herd in the spring, a significant financial risk that required borrowing against the property, but one that the October sale had convinced her was potentially very worthwhile. She had run the numbers and she was confident. She laid out the plan to Amos over the kitchen table one evening, after the supper things were cleared, in the new easy way they had of using the kitchen table as a kind of planning room now that the formality had shifted between them. He listened to the whole plan and then said, carefully, that he thought the debt risk was higher than she had accounted for given the unpredictability of the water supply in a dry year. He laid out his reasoning in calm specifics. Mae listened and found that she disagreed with one of his central assumptions about the reliability of the East Spring and said so, also in calm specifics. The conversation sharpened, not into anger, but into that particular friction of two people who both have strong opinions and both believe they are right. At the end of it, neither of them had changed the other's position entirely, but they had each adjusted their view by some degrees, and the plan that Mae eventually settled on, which she settled on herself, because it was her property and her decision, was a modified version that addressed his central concern while still being bold enough to matter. She told him this 2 days later, laying out the revised plan, and he studied it and said, "That is better than both of our original positions." "That is generally what happens when people argue honestly," Mae said. He smiled at her. "Generally," he agreed. "I was going to say something less gracious." "What were you going to say?" "I was going to say you were right." "I was right and you were also right," she said. "They are compatible positions." "You are an exceptionally reasonable person," he said, and the way he said it conveyed that he meant it as the specific compliment it was. December came with cold nights and the intimacies of the season, the way shared warmth becomes important and the world contracts to firelight and lamplight and the people one can depend on. Mae and Amos had by now developed a rhythm together that had the feel of something long established rather than new, which surprised her and delighted her in equal measure. He was at the kitchen table more evenings than not, sometimes working, sometimes just reading while she worked, and she found his presence in the house not intrusive but restorative, like something that had been missing from a room and was now correctly in place. He kissed her for the first time in December, on a cold, clear afternoon when they were coming back from checking the south herd and their breath made clouds in the air, and the mountains were white all the way down to the tree line. She had said something that made him laugh, a genuine full laugh, which was still a gift each time it happened, and then the laughter had subsided, and they were looking at each other on horseback with the white mountains behind them, and he leaned toward her and she leaned toward him, and it was something careful and warm and right. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been aware of it. And you did not say anything." "I was enjoying the anticipation," she said, which made him laugh again, and she thought that if she had to choose one thing to keep out of everything she had, it might be the sound of him laughing. Christmas in the Loma Blanca Valley was modest and warm. Caridad and her children came for Christmas dinner, and the Delgado family came, and Ernesto Delgado, who was 80 years old and had seen much of the world change, and had his own well-developed opinions about everything, sat in the armchair by the fire and watched Amos and me move around each other in the kitchen, with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to recognize a thing for what it was. When me brought him his coffee, he caught her arm and held it for a moment and looked up at her with his dark old eyes and said, "He is a good man, that one. I have been watching." "I know he is," me said. "Your father would have liked him," Ernesto said, which was the highest compliment he had in his possession, because he had loved me's father with the loyalty of 40 years of neighboring, and he knew what it meant. She squeezed the old man's hand and went back to the kitchen, and when she passed Amos, he caught her eye with a questioning look that asked if she was all right, and she nodded and smiled, and he nodded back, and it was one of those small wordless exchanges that only exist between people who have learned each other. January of 1879 arrived with the particular severity it reserves for the high desert in winter, and with it came a situation that put things in sharper relief. A man named Cole Briard came to the valley unrelated to the sheriff, a different family entirely, and he was the representative of a land company from back east that had been buying up ranches in the territory wherever it saw an opportunity. He came to the Rhodes ranch on a cold Tuesday morning in his good coat, and his well-shined boots, and his manner of a man who expected to be negotiating from a position of clear advantage. He offered Mae Rhodes a price for her property that was, she recognized immediately, about a third of what it was worth. He explained this with considerable smoothness, citing market uncertainties and the challenges of the territory and the complications of a property managed by a woman alone, which last thing he said with the specific delicacy of someone who considered it a trump card. Amos was in the barn when Briard arrived. Me handled the meeting herself, in the kitchen, with coffee that she did not offer to refill. She told Cole Briard, with the politeness she would have given any guest and the clarity she gave any business adversary, that his price was insulting, and his assessment of her capacity to manage her own property was incorrect, and she had no interest in selling at any price. Briard pressed several times in several ways, which did not help his cause, and eventually me stood up and indicated the door, and Briard left with less dignity than he had arrived. Amos was coming from the barn when Briard walked to his horse, and they passed each other in the yard, and me watched from the doorway as the two men looked at each other with the specific assessment of men who can each read the other's purpose at a glance. Briard rode out and Amos came to the porch. "Land company," he said. "Yes," me said. "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly," she said. "He was not the sort of man who threatens explicitly. He was the sort who implies." Amos stood in the cold air on the porch steps, and his expression had that quality she recognized from his description of Hendricks in Rojo Creek, not anger, but a kind of focused, controlled attention to a situation that required it. "He will come back," he said. "He may," me agreed, "or he will send someone else. These companies rarely accept the first refusal. Your title documents are all in order," he said. "They are," she said. "My father was meticulous and I have maintained everything." He nodded. "Then there is nothing to worry about that a lawyer cannot handle if it comes to that." "I know a lawyer in Santa Fe," me said. "I have been considering writing to him on a precautionary basis." "That seems wise," she looked at him. "I am not frightened of them," she said. "I want you to know that. I am irritated, but I am not frightened." "I know," he said. "That is one of the many things about you that He stopped, and she saw him selecting a word with care. "That I admire," he finished. The word was not the first word he had selected, and they both knew it, and the warmth that went between them was quiet and steady. She wrote to the Santa Fe lawyer, a careful man named Mr. Archuleta, who had handled her father's estate, and he wrote back confirming everything was in order and offering to register an official statement of her ownership and refusal at the Territorial Records Office, which she asked him to do. Briard came back once more, in February, with a slightly higher number and the same underlying architecture of condescension, and me refused him with even less warmth than the first time. He did not come back again. February was cold and contained and largely uneventful in the best way, the way of a life finding its shape. Me was aware of being happy with a clarity she had not had in a long time. Not the complicated happiness of early romance, which is shot through with uncertainty and the fear of loss, but something steadier and more established. She trusted Amos. She trusted that he was who she had determined him to be, because she had been a careful and attentive observer for the better part of 6 months, and she had found nothing to contradict her understanding. And she trusted herself, which perhaps mattered most. On a cold February evening when the wind was doing something significant outside and they were both at the kitchen table, she with her accounts, he with the almanac he was using to plan the spring planting of the kitchen garden, which he had taken on with a characteristic thoroughness that she found consistently endearing, she looked up from her ledger and said, "Amos." He looked up. "I want you to stay," she said. "Not as the hired hand. I want you to stay." He put the almanac down very carefully. He looked at her with the complete, focused attention he gave to things that mattered, and she held his gaze and did not look away. "Are you asking me to marry you?" he said. "I am," she said. He was quiet for one moment, and she watched his face move through something deep and real, the working of a feeling too complex and too full to produce easily. Then he said, "Yes, me. I am saying yes with everything I have." She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the wind outside and the warmth of the kitchen between them and 4 months of careful, earned, honest love bringing them to this moment. They were married in April of 1879, when the valley was in its finest state. The cottonwoods budding new green and the Sangre de Cristos still capped with snow, but the valleys below them blooming with the particular wildflowers that only New Mexico produces, tiny and fierce and brilliantly colored. The ceremony was performed by the minister from the town of Mora, who rode out for the occasion, and it was held in the yard of the Rhodes Ranch, which was, from that day, the Walden Ranch too, by me's clear and deliberate instruction, with every person in the valley who wished to attend in attendance. Caridad Lema stood beside me as her closest friend and cried throughout with the unashamed emotion of a warm-hearted woman. Ernesto Delgado sat in a chair brought out from the house for him, and smiled the smile of a man who has been right about something and is allowing himself to know it. Cliff and Dell stood together in the back and wore their good shirts and looked at the ground when they were moved, and at the sky when they were pleased, which was their manner for the duration. Ruth Calvert came down from Rojo Creek, having written me a letter 3 weeks prior that was part congratulation, and part the kind of gracious reckoning that Ruth, being Ruth, had clearly been composing since the day she had gotten me's letter asking what Amos Walden had actually done. She told me directly, standing in the yard before the ceremony, that her original warning had been one of the finest errors of her life, because it had started a chain of inquiry that had led to this. Me had laughed and hugged her friend, and told her she thought that was exactly the right way to understand it. Garland Price had sent a letter of congratulations from Cimarron, but could not make the distance. Sheriff Briggs, who was passing through the valley on his regular circuit 3 days after the wedding, stopped at the ranch on his way through and shook Amos Walden's hand with something that looked like respect and said, with his characteristic economy, "Those are different things. which Amos understood to be a reference to his original letter, and accepted with a nod and a handshake that was firm on both ends. The summer of 1879 was the finest the valley had seen in years, and the Walden Ranch, Mae insisted on the shared name, which pleased Amos in a way he could not quite articulate but which she could read clearly flourished with the energy and planning they had put into it together. The expanded spring herd did well. The east spring held. The kitchen garden produced an abundance that fed them and much of the neighborhood. Amos took on the management of the north section with a completeness that allowed me to give more attention to the financial side of the operation, which was her strength, and the combination worked with the efficiency of two people doing the things they were individually best at while understanding everything the other was doing. They were equal in it, which was something Mae had not expected, and something Amos had not explicitly promised, but had simply produced by virtue of who he was. He did not regard her competence as competition. He did not manage her. He worked beside her. In September, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, over coffee, with the same directness she had always used with him, because she did not know how to be indirect about things that mattered. He set his cup down and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, and could not categorize except to say that it was the most open thing she had ever seen from him. He came around the table and held her face in both hands and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a long time without saying anything, and neither of them could say afterward which of them had been crying, though it might have been both. Their son was born in April of 1880, 1 year almost to the day from their wedding. They named him Samuel after Mae's father. He arrived in the way first children often do, with considerable drama and considerable effort, and at the end of it, an exhausted and triumphant Mae holding a red-faced, robust boy who made his opinions about the world known immediately and at volume. Amos sat beside the bed with his hand in hers and looked at his son with that expression he had shown so rarely. The completely open, unguarded one, and Mae watched him discover what it was to love a child, which is a different thing from any other love, and which came over him visibly and immediately and completely. Caridad came the next morning with food and warmth, and held the baby with the expertise of a woman who had 3 of her own, and announced that Samuel was magnificent and would grow up to run the entire territory, which was a woman's prerogative to say about a healthy newborn, and which everyone received with the appropriate mixture of amusement and delight. Cliff held the baby once, standing in the yard in the afternoon, with the careful terror of a man of 65 who was certain he was going to break something, and then gave him back and walked back to the fence he was mending, and did not look at me for the rest of the afternoon because he was too moved to manage eye contact. Del called the baby a good-looking fellow and went back to his coffee, which was as eloquent as Del got. Old Ernesto Delgado came the following week, moving slowly these days but still sharp in every way that mattered, and sat in the kitchen chair, and held young Samuel and spoke to him in Spanish for 10 minutes about the valley and the mountains, and what they expected from the people who lived among them. Mae watched and felt her heart full in a way that seemed to expand the available space for it. The years that followed built on each other with the good solidity of things correctly made. Mae and Amos worked the ranch together and grew it with care and without recklessness. They had a second child in 1882, a girl they named Eliza. Mae had proposed the name, and Amos had been unable to speak for a moment when she said it, and then had said yes, and thank you, in a voice that was very quiet. Eliza was different from Samuel in every way. Where he was loud, she was observant. Where he moved through the world like a small force of nature, she moved through it with her father's particular watchfulness. But they were alike in their confidence, and in the way they loved their parents and were loved back, which was comprehensive and abiding and daily. In 1883, Samuel turned 3 and could say the names of most of the horses, and had strong opinions about which he preferred, which his father took seriously, and his mother found regularly hilarious. Eliza at 1 year was beginning to pull herself upright and was conducting research into what happened when various objects were dropped from various heights with the focused intensity of a scientist, which she definitely got from her mother. Amos Walden, who had arrived at the Rhodes Ranch in the summer of 1878 with a reputation assembled from incomplete observations and the fear of people who had not taken the trouble to understand what they had seen, had become something entirely different in the Loma Blanca Valley. He was known here. He was understood. He was the man at the Walden Ranch who worked harder than most, who treated his wife as a full partner and equal, who helped his neighbors without being asked, and without keeping accounts of what he was owed, who had been at the Lemma barn fire and had never mentioned it again because it was simply what a neighbor did. He was the man who had arrived described as dangerous by 3 separate, well-intentioned people, and who had been, in each case, not dangerous in the way they had meant, but entirely dangerous in the way that mattered, which was that he had the capacity to disrupt the comfortable stories people told themselves about strangers, about risk, about who deserved the benefit of the doubt. Mae Rhodes, Mae Walden, though she kept the Rhodes name alongside it, as her own name and her father's name, and the name of the land she had been raised on, thought about this sometimes. She thought about the 3 letters and the decision she had made to ask questions instead of loading the rifle. She thought about how easy it would have been to do the other thing, how straightforward, how socially acceptable, how widely endorsed, how 3 perfectly decent, well-meaning people had warned her on the basis of what they had seen and feared, and how none of them had been lying exactly. They had each been telling her what they understood, but none of them had been telling her the whole truth either, because they had not pursued it. She had pursued it. And the pursuit had led her here, to this kitchen, to this April morning in 1883, with Samuel at the table practicing his letters with a stick in the flour she had spread on the board for him to practice in, and Eliza on the floor with the wooden animals her father had made her over the winter, and Amos coming through the back door with the cold morning air still on his jacket, and the look on his face when he saw her that she had never stopped feeling the particular warmth of, which was the look of a man who came home and found the best thing he knew waiting for him there. He came to the table and kissed her, which made Samuel say, "Papa kissed Mama," in the tone of a delighted reporter, and scooped Eliza up from the floor and held her against his chest, and she grabbed his chin with both hands as she always did, and me put the coffee on, and the morning began in earnest. They were running the South herd count that day, and after the breakfast things were cleared and the children were settled, Caridad had begun bringing her eldest daughter Resita to help with the children on working days, an arrangement that worked beautifully for everyone. Me and Amos rode out together in the spring morning. The valley was in its finest April state, the hills green from the winter rains, the cottonwoods in new leaf, the mountains clear and white-capped to the north. They rode side by side in the easy, comfortable way of people who have ridden this land together for 5 years and know every rise and dip of it. "I was thinking," Amos said, as they came up the first rise that gave a view of the whole south section. "About what?" Me said. "The north section fence. When we put in the new posts this autumn, I thought we might extend the line by 1/4 mile and consider whether the ground there is suitable for—" "Amos," she said. He looked at her. "You were not thinking about the fence," she said. He smiled in the way that had taken 4 months to arrive and had never left. "No," he admitted. "I was thinking that 5 years ago I rode into this valley with 3 people's warnings about me following me, and I do not know what I expected. Not this." He looked out at the valley, at the land and the spring morning. "Not any of this." Me looked at him, this man she had chosen on the basis of evidence rather than fear, who had given her everything since and asked for nothing except what was freely given. "What did you expect?" she said. "Another place to pass through," he said simply. She reached over and took his hand, and they held it between their horses for a moment, the way they sometimes did when words were sufficient but touch was more. "You stayed," she said. "You asked me to," he said. "You were already going to," she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes. "Yes," he said, "I was." Below them the south herd moved in the morning light, the cattle slow and deliberate in the green grass, and above them the hawks made their wide circles in the warm air. And the Sangre de Cristos stood witness to the north as they had always stood, as they would always stand, over this valley and the people in it who had decided to make it their life. Me and Amos turned their horses down the slope toward the work of the morning, toward the ranch they had built together, and the children waiting at home, and the years that were still coming. The good years, the hard years, the ordinary, extraordinary years that make up a life fully lived in a place fully chosen. The spring light made everything clear and bright, and the day stretched ahead of them with all its promise and all its work and all its abundance. And they rode into it together as they had ridden into every day for 5 years and would ride into every day to come, unhurried and certain and side by side. The 3 letters still lived in Me's wooden box, folded and yellowed at the edges now. She had kept them alongside Garland's apology, Ruth's gracious reckoning, and the sheriff's 3 plain sentences. He is not a man to fear. He is a man to understand. Those are different things. She kept them not as a reminder of danger but as a reminder of something more important, that the best things in a life often come disguised in other people's fears, and that the distance between a warning and a truth is bridged only by the willingness to ask the right question. She had asked. He had answered. And the rest had been the work and the joy and the ordinary miracle of 2 people who had chosen each other clearly and completely. Out there in the wide, sun-hammered beauty of the New Mexico territory, in the good, hard life of the West, which was exactly what it was and nothing it was not, and which had been, in every way that mattered, enough.